Hi, in this module we're looking at the development of permaculture and how the original ideas behind permaculture have developed over the years, and the founders of permaculture and their background and their involvement in developing the permaculture movement. So permaculture developed in 1979 by David Holmgren and Bill Mollison. At that time they were, Bill Mollison was a lecturer at the Tasmania University, and David Holmgren was a student there, and Bill Mollison was developing a program around sustainable agriculture and sustainable developments. And the thinking behind Bill Mollison and the development of the program that he was working on was spending 20 years prior to that working for the Wildlife Service and on boats out in the ocean and doing quite a wide variety of jobs. And the accumulation of all those ideas led to him thinking about how you can apply design type thinking to creating sustainable habitats, because it was his observation that we were quite good at designing various things to do with the lives that we inhabit, but as far as creating sustainable agricultural systems, that was an area that we didn't really apply as much design thinking into as we have done in other areas. So he really tried to hone in on getting the best ideas of our creative design potential and harnessing that within the agricultural landscape to create nice sustainable systems. So together with David Holmgren, he developed a permaculture curriculum, and since developing that, he then went on to develop a permaculture designer's manual, which was the foundation for the permaculture curriculum. And he traveled globally sharing this curriculum with people, training up people to be teachers, and help spread the permaculture message around the world. In the meantime, David Holmgren spent 20 years refining the permaculture principles, and he came up with the book, The Principles of Permaculture. So he tried to really refine what it meant to be a permaculture design and what are the criteria or what kind of objectives can you refer to in creating a permaculture design. So it acted as a framework that a permaculture designer could refer to help determine if their design meets certain criteria. So we'll go into those permaculture principles soon. The definition of permaculture, just about everyone has a different definition of what it means, but broadly, the origin of the word comes from permanent agriculture. So if you take those two words, permanent agriculture, and condense them, that's where permaculture comes from. And what it really is a design science that applies a toolkit of different sustainable living techniques into one design curriculum. So it's taking the ideas of sustainable land management, sustainable energy production, sustainable water harvest on your landscape, combining all those elements into a design type science. And the benefit of that is there's no real set of procedures that define what permaculture is. And the benefit of that is that if you say, well, this isn't permaculture or this is permaculture, it's hard to do, because permaculture is just a way of harnessing different techniques and applying it to an objective, which is creating a sustainable agricultural landscape or even a sustainable culture. And there's various people that kind of rebel a little bit against the permaculture word and say that it's too narrow and it's too prescriptive and it doesn't really encompass their vision of what sustainable development and sustainable agriculture can look like. But the beauty really is that permaculture is quite all-encompassing and can take these diverse ideas into its umbrella and apply them in a logical design sequence. So permaculture in a nutshell is earth care, people care, and fair share. So the earth care part of it comes into play in that when you've got a agricultural production system, doing it in such a way that actually cares for the earth systems as part of that production system. So for example, if you're in a pastoral type production system, like it's common here in New Zealand, how can you develop that agricultural system in a way that doesn't degrade the surrounding landscape and protects the natural ecology of that landscape. So obviously you need to diversify those systems and integrate different elements into it. And that's really what is at the heart of permaculture. It's taking different production systems and integrating them together in a way that's holistic and has a beneficial or mutualistically beneficial impact on the surrounding ecosystems. So the earth care is production in a way that doesn't harm the environment. Okay, so people care. There's probably a lot of different ways to think about this. One I think that's quite good is the fear, I guess, of the number of people that are in the planet these days and providing for them with food and shelter and good livelihoods and jobs and a stable financial system. And if you create a landscape that is diverse and abundant, requires quite a high interaction to maintain it, it creates a lot of job opportunities for people and provides for those job opportunities in an environment that is nice to live in and nurturing to live in. So the people care is really creating systems which nurture and sustain people and provide them with the optimal habitat for them to live in. And the last part, fair share, is really when you're creating a system which is overabundant in what it supplies, how can you fairly distribute those resources? And that can be amongst the people in the community, it can be between people and nature, so sharing that harvest with nature and working in with the wildlife of that area so that they can co-inhabit those spaces and not the production from those spaces is not solely being extracted for human consumption, but is being shared with the wildlife of that area as well. So fair share between the people in the environment and between the people and the wildlife of the environment. Okay, the principles of permaculture. So these were developed by David Holmgren, and he spent a good 20 years after first forming the permaculture concept with Bill Mollison, refining these principles and really fine-tuning his thinking around if you were to create a set of principles which would help guide a permaculture designer and act as like the go-to reference that a designer could do a landscape design and then have like a checklist of things that they can then go through on their design and say, does it do this, that, the other? So it's kind of like the intention or the objectives that help guide a permaculture design. So there's 12 of them. They were designed around the points of a clock face, so 1 to 12 around a clock, and each one represented by a different symbol. But I'll just go through now and just briefly outline what the intention of each of the main principles are. So the first one is observe and interact. And the importance of this is that instead of rushing in too much and applying too much of what you think is a good idea in a landscape, it's to really take the time to slow down, observe what's going on around you, and use that feedback to help inform and progress your design. Because whatever you do in a design, it's going to change over time, and your own objectives and your own thinking is going to evolve and progress over time too. So taking that time to observe and interact is allowing the environment to give you that feedback to help guide and evolve your design that you're applying to that landscape. So it's really taking time to receive feedback from environment. So it's really taking the time to receive the feedback from the environment to guide the design. And the better a designer becomes to observe the landscape, the better designer they become. And I think a good discipline around applying the observe and interact is doing a diary of some type. So creating that intention within your daily practice to help refine your ability to make meaningful observations of your landscape and reflect on those observations. And it's really that ability to be aware of what's going around you, to be able to interpret that awareness and apply it into your design that will make you a good designer. I've always thought that permaculture is really two things. One is having an understanding of the tools and techniques that you apply to a design. The other one is having good observation and being able to apply feedback to help shape and guide how you apply those tools and those techniques to a particular landscape. So I think, you know, that observe and interact is one of the foundation, really important things to get right as a permaculture designer. Catch and store energy. A good way to kind of visualize this is the web, because a web used for catching flies in the case of a spider web, but in an environment in general, a web serves the purpose to capture what energy is flowing through that system and make the best use of that energy before it's lost. And the best way that nature does this is creating food webs. So in a food web, there's many interactions between different animals and plants within an environment, and each one of those interactions is an opportunity for the energy that was first harnessed by the plants and changed into biological tissues. It's an opportunity for that energy to be transferred to another organism before that energy leaves that ecosystem. So that web of interaction between all the different elements in that ecosystem is providing an opportunity to capture that energy that's moving through that ecosystem and spread it out amongst all the different organisms before it's lost again. It can be applied to different things as well. So biologically speaking, if you want to catch and store energy, you do that by having good diversity and having good connection between the different elements in your system. So having plant guilds, for example, where the plants have beneficial interactions within each other, and you've got grazers coming through and having other interactions with those systems. So all of those diverse interactions creates opportunity to catch and store the energy flowing through the biological systems. There's also water flowing through systems, and if you capture and store and spread out that water that's flowing through that system, the destructive potential of that water is reduced. So instead of eroding the landscape, it's held up in the landscape, it has time to be absorbed into the soil, and as it's been absorbed into the soil, it has then opportunity to be absorbed by plants and taken up and help support photosynthesis and the growth of the plants. For your own use, for your own energy consumption on a farm, you could also capture and store the energy for your own use. So you might have a water wheel, if you've got a stream running through your property, where you're making use of the gravitational potential energy of the water flowing through and transforming that into electrical potential, or a windmill that does the same with the wind energy that's going through. Or you could capture and store solar power on a solar array on your rooftop. But in a permaculture design, you're trying to create a functional complexity on it that will help capture and store that energy. So main objective is to create a functional complexity to make the best use of the energy flowing through that system. Energy available. Okay, obtain a yield. So that ties in with the energy, because a yield is a type of energy, whether it's a biological yield or a water yield or an energy yield, they all relate to the energy that's flowing through that ecosystem. And you want to be able to design your system in a way that it's creating an abundance of productive elements that you can obtain a yield from. And that yield may be just for your own sustenance, so you might be your objective might be for self-sufficiency. Oh, excuse me. So your objective might be for self-sufficiency, and you're trying to obtain a yield to support your own livelihood on that farm. Or your yield might be a financial one, so you want to be able to transform the yield off the farm into a financial yield. And there's lots of different elements in doing that successfully. At the production level, the elements are designing a system which has good beneficial interactions that creates an oversupply of a certain product within that ecosystem, and that oversupply you can then harness for production. And then once that harnessing for production takes place, being able to align that production with the market value and where the demands are in that market, maybe upscaling your production, so turning it into different products that can get a better return from that primary production. But the accumulative impact of all those different ideas is to be able to obtain a good functional yield. So tailoring production towards useful yields. And it might not be just food production you're talking about too. The yield might be one of community. So if your permaculture design is one which is primarily involved with strengthening community and providing a good kind of good activities within that community that helps strengthen positive interactions between people in that community, the yield that you get would be those social interactions and the beneficial feeling from doing it. Okay, apply self-regulation and accept feedback. So it ties in a little bit with this observe and interact. So based upon those observations and the interactions that you've made, you then apply self-regulation and how you enact that design, and you accept the feedback from the environment to make little tweaks and modifications to your design that will change the assembly of your species and how things fit together in the production that's possible. So it's really fine-tuning, I guess, your initial design and your initial intention based on the feedback from the environment, and making subtle alterations to fit in with that feedback to optimize your production. So it's making use of feedback, to modify design and optimize production or yield. Okay, so we're moving on. So use and value renewable resources and services. If it's renewable, it's one that can be constantly extracted from. And the best example of a renewable resources are those that are provided by the environment, like sun and wind and water, and constant supply and a renewable supply in the environment. But also biological systems. Biological systems are self-perpetuating. They can breed up, they can expand, and that is a renewable resource. If you harness the biological potential of a system, it's renewable. And what we tend to do is focus on consumption of fossil fuels and technological designs for something that doesn't really make use of those renewable resources. And the application of that can be quite interesting. There was one example I saw recently where it was a person in a glass house. So in this glass house, they had solar panels on the roof, and the solar panels were used to pump up salt water and to desalinate the salt water to create fresh water to then irrigate those plants and that was mostly done hydroponically, and there was an import of fertilizers to be able to fertilize these plants living in this glass house under aquaponic solutions. And this was promoted as being the ultimate kind of sustainable production system, because it was using solar panel to desalinate salt water to create into fresh water. So it was using one renewable resource, which was the sun, and therefore based on that use of a renewable resource, the whole production was said to be renewable. But if you consider, the production of all of those materials and the fertilizers and the construction of the glasshouse, and you compare that to the output of energy from the food produced, then you can soon see that it's not very renewable, because there's a lot more energy and resources required to put into that system than is obtained out of that system. So a good kind of litmus test of if your system is based on renewable resources and services is, do you obtain more energy from the production of that system than is required from the energy to put into that system? So I'll just put that up here as the litmus test. So litmus test equals more energy obtained from production than is required as an input. And in a simplified system where you've got you kind of control that environment, like that glasshouse example, it requires a tremendous amount of inputs and a very little in comparison output. And that's true of any simplified production system. Unless you harness the biology of a system and the services from that biology. So like a forest, for example. In a forest, if you walk into a forest, you can obtain birds from that forest, or animals from that forest, and mushrooms and timber and berries. You can obtain all these resources out of that forest, and it doesn't require any input of any resources from you to sustain that production. So you can sustainably extract all of these resources from it without any input of resources into that forest. So that would be the ultimate example of a renewable resource, because the litmus test is you've got far more energy obtained from that system than was required to put into that system. And on a production system on your farm, there is going to be quite a few energy inputs required to particularly set up that system, but also maintain that system. But ultimately you want to be able to create beneficial interactions between elements in that system, so that you're always obtaining more energy out of that system than you have to put into that system to maintain it. So that's always a good way to kind of look at your design and evaluate your design, is make a list of everything that was required to produce it, energy of time, resources, materials, equipment, and offset that against the output of resources and energy. And if you're not getting more out of that system than went into that system, then ultimately it's not a sustainable system. Even if you're using solar panels to use solar energy or desalinate water, or using these great technologies, if it's requiring more input into it, it's ultimately not sustainable. Okay, so produce no waste. In a system, maybe no waste is a bit of a ultimate goal, and a lot of the time, there is some sort of waste produced from a system, but it's really looking at whatever waste is produced from a system, making use of that as an input into another system. So ideally, all of the wastes from a production system are recycled back within that production system, so that they no longer become a waste that has a detrimental impact to the surrounding natural ecosystem. So, for example, if you've got grazers moving through that system, potential waste could be their manure. If that's produced in excess quantities, it will enter into the runoff, enter into streams and rivers, pollute those rivers, create eutrophication, which is when you get a spike in the nutrient levels and you get algae blooming in those systems and smothering the environment so that other fish can't live in it. So instead of that happening, reducing the number of grazers, having them operate in that system so that they're moved around into new spaces, and the manures they produce are being absorbed not only by grasses but trees and other systems, so that they're not entering into streams and rivers in excess quantities that will be harmful to those systems. And sometimes, small amounts of manures and fertilizers and things entering into a natural system is not going to be harmful to that system. It's only in excess quantities that it will be harmful. And at the moment, all agricultural production systems, because they're so simplified, require a high input of resources and energy and fertility to maintain their production, and also produce a large amount of waste. So the only way to really produce no waste is to create lots of beneficial interactions within your production system, so that the sources of wastes are becoming inputs into other types of production systems. And it's only by having that complexity in your system that you can recycle those resources within your system and make use of them in other parts of your system. And really what you're trying to do here is emulate how a natural ecosystem works. So in an ecosystem, like if you've got a pond, for example, and you've got all these birds in the pond continuously pooing into that pond, if there weren't all these plants that were in that pond and algae and invertebrates and things making use of those nutrients, then it would become a pollution. So it's that functional complexity that's in that pond natural system that is making use of that input of fertility from all of the bird poo and using it as an input into production of other types of systems, so that you get this lush and productive plant growth on the borders and inside that pond. So in a similar way, in a production system, you want to look at what types of waste are being produced. You might focus on, say, 3 types of main production and look at their inputs and outputs. Within those 3 types, you might want to integrate them together, but some of their outputs might not integrate in just 3 elements. So you might have other elements in your farm that are in support of your main 3 elements, or to make use of their waste so that it's not entering into the surrounding environment and polluting it. So produce no waste is creating this functional complexity to recycle resources within that system so that they don't enter into natural environments to become a waste. Okay, so designing from patterns to detail. So, and that one's really referring to having a look at the big patterns within your landscape before really fine-tuning your attention. So it's these big patterns, it's your topography, what type of soil you have, which is going to have a big impact on what types of plants will do best in that landscape. The hours of sunshine. Certain fruiting plants will only produce good fruit if they get a certain range of hours of sunshine, so making sure your selection of different fruiting trees matches the hours of sunshine that they require. The rainfall of the area, so is it quite low and you want to capture and store that rainfall? Is it quite high? Do you want to really make use of it but not store it too much, let it flow off your landscape before it's erodes too much? Elevation, so how far away from the sea you are, how the temperature changes during the year as a consequence of that, how the weather patterns change during the year as a consequence of that, and your other general seasonal changes. So when do you get the dry spells and the hot spells during the year? When is it colder? Where do your main winds come from? And once you understand all these main elements that help shape your production system, you can then organize what is best suited to different places of your landscape, what factors you want to minimalize. So if it's a destructive wind, you want to be able to create shelter that will minimize the destruction of that. If you're not getting much sunshine, you want to maximize that. So you want to be able to create a production system that's really open up to where your sun's coming from to maximize the hours of sunshine it gets. Same with temperature. You might want to create solar stores by having rock faces or grow things along walls that help store the heat that is available in that landscape and transfer that heat into the production of your crops in that landscape. So whatever these big patterns are will influence the design that you lay out on that landscape. Okay, so integrate rather than segregate. So that is a concept that's been behind some of the other ones previously too, and it's the idea that you want to create a sustainable and resilient production system that really does require on an integration of your production elements in a way that is going to be stable. And in my own business, AgriFutures, I've got a number of production systems that each in themselves have got functional complexity within how they operate. So there's a plant guild of beneficial plants featured around a year of harvest or a particular production type like an apple harvest or an aquaponics system. And the idea of the designs that I put together is that each one of those systems can be integrated in different ways depending on the objectives of the person that owns the property and the features of that landscape to create this functional integration. So instead of each system being separate to each other and requiring its own separate input of resources and potentially creating waste as well, if you interconnect those systems, then the input of one can come from the output of another system, and therefore the resources are being recycled in that system to create this web of diversity that helps store the energy that's flowing through your landscape, helps recycle material within those production systems so that as little waste as possible is produced as it leaves those systems. So it's really creating beneficial interactions between the different elements within your landscape. Use small and slow solutions. So it's often recommended when you first move on to a landscape that you should spend the first year just observing that landscape and seeing different things like where does it dry out during summer, where does it get boggy during the winter, and if you get a high rainfall during winter like we do in New Zealand, how high the groundwater is, where frost pockets are in your landscape, how different wildlife elements might cause problems at different times of the year or could create a resource at different times of the year. And based on all those observations, building up an understanding of all the different factors within that landscape in which your production system can be designed within, so it fits within those complexities that you've identified in your landscape. So a lot of those complexities and the way your production system aligns itself with those complexities and interacts with those complexities, it takes time to be able to observe those, and if you rush things too much, you can get yourself into sticky situations or traps where you're having to put more resources into getting yourself out of those situations than if you just took things a little bit quieter, put small amounts of resources in it over time and just kind of stood back and see the effect of making those small changes on the interactions between all the elements in that system. So that you're requiring less investment because your investment is spread over a longer time and going in smaller quantities, so that you have time to see the effect of those inputs. But it also gives you a better understanding of how different little tweaks or inputs into that system, the effect of those different tweaks on that system. So you're giving yourself time to be able to respond to that feedback better. So it's a good strategy to be able to save money and to be able to observe, have that time to make those observations and respond to them creative. To use and value diversity. So really what you're trying to do in a production system is to create functional diversity, so picking elements that have some productive output And a good way sometimes to guide that is to look at natural systems and use the complexity and the interactions within that system to help guide how you recreate that complex functional diversity within your production systems. So if you look at what most of our agricultural species come from, it's that kind of woodland savanna type system. So it's a mixture of grasslands and patches of forests and herbs, and in that kind of patchy environment there's lots of edges, there's lots of diversity, there's quite a range of species adapted to making use of different niches within that environment. So there may be grazers of the grass, there may be browsers of the shrubs and the trees and the herbs, different species adapted to living in those trees and making use of those resources. And amongst the plant communities, there's grasses and herbs that like to be in the more open areas, and trees and shrubs that might like to be grouped in clusters in their own little community. So you can recreate that kind of complex diversity within that type of system within your own production system. And for each species that you look at how those naturally occurring species can be substituted for different types of species that have a yield of something that's more useful to us. So instead of being a zebra that you'd see on a savanna in Africa, you could replace that by a horse, or instead of a buffalo, a cow. Instead of various birds, you could have chickens and geese and turkeys. Instead of a lot of the trees, you could have the fruit trees and nut trees and nitrogen fixating trees and nutrient accumulating shrubs. But in those substituted species that you are picking, try to recreate that functional complexity that matches what you see in that natural system. And what we tend to do is we simplify our production, because we just want to do one thing to a big scale and harvest it as efficiently as possible, and that in its very nature is in opposition to having that functional diversity within your system. So to create that functional diversity, you want to often do things to a smaller scale with more complexity and more interaction in a way that models what that natural system operates like. And once you get that right, then you get something that's more resilient and self-sufficient and doesn't require waste, doesn't require much input. It looks after itself. Those functional diversity within that system helps stabilize that system and make it more resilient and sustainable over time, so that we don't have to put so much effort and resources into sustaining it. So one way to look at how to use and value diversity is to model that off a natural system and substitute the species for productive ones. So to use and value the marginal. So just as I was saying in that last example, the more edges there are in a system, the more productive that system becomes. So if you have a look at a forest, for example, if you have a look right in the middle of the forest, you get certain species dominating in that system. But if you move to the edge of that forest, you're getting more diversity in the interactions between different systems, and that's creating more edges, creating more diversity, creating more niches for different species. And like I was saying with that woodland example, where there's a great number of different edges and niches within that system, creating a system that looks like that gives you the maximum ability to harness production from that system. And you can relate it to lots of different types of environments. If it's a pond type system, if you've got a big edge in that pond, so instead of having a round pond, you could have a pond with an irregular edge, which creates more edges around the edge of that pond. Instead of having one big kind of forested system in your landscape, you could have a grazing system with smaller patches of forest spread out throughout your landscape. And by doing that, in both cases, you're getting more edges. So you're getting more edges around the pond, and you're getting more edges around the forest. And that allows you to, that increases the production, because the nature of edges in themselves is to be more productive, because when you're getting an interaction between two types of systems, whether it's the terrestrial and the aquatic, or the forest and the grazing system, those edges are more productive because there's more interactions going on, there's more recycling of nutrients, there's more energy flow in those systems. So the production is going to increase, but also you've got more diversity amongst the species that can inhabit each system. So in the pond, there's only going to be certain species that can live in the middle of the pond, but there's a greater diversity of species that can live around the edges. Same with in the forest, there's only a certain number that can live in the middle of the forest, but in the edges there's hundreds of them. And there's also hundreds of edge species between the meadow and the forest. So you're creating an environment by having more edges where you're allowing more diversity to be produced in that system and more production to be possible because of all the energy and nutrient recycling. So by doing that, you're creating more opportunity for production. Okay, so last one, so it's been 12 principles, quite a lot to get your head around, but last one is to creatively use and respond to change. So as you're using small and slow solutions, as you're applying self-feedback and regulating your responses in response to the feedback from the environment, the actions that you take in response to all that feedback, as much as possible, well, you need to utilize your creativity. The one resources that humans can do very well, we're not good at a lot of things, but one thing we are good at is our creativity, and to be able to use that creativity to respond to changes and come up with productive solutions to that. And I find that quite an interesting concept because we tend to like stability and create routine and comfort in our lives, but when we have a little bit of disturbance in our lives and things change for us and we've got to kind of really reanalyze how we do things and use our creativity to adapt what we do, that's where the best solutions of being human come from. So it's good in a production system that you're trying to achieve to make use of that creative response to changes in your environment, to tweak what you're doing and to respond to the feedback from the environment and come up with new and interesting solutions. And it's something you can apply to your own life. And I think throughout all of these permaculture principles, what's really interesting about them is that it provides a framework that can not only guide you in what you do on a landscape production system, but it can also guide you in any type of system. So if you're in an education system and you want to be able to really have a set of guiding principles that really help guide your practice and what you do in that education environment and how you respond to all the variables in that environment, you can apply those permaculture principles to that situation. If you want to set up a business and you want a framework of ideas to help guide you in what you do and analyze your results that you're getting and improvements you can make, again, you can apply that. Or social community situations, again, you can refer to those principles to help guide you through those interactions. So it creates great value in that you can use this permaculture principles understanding in any context of life to help guide you through that context and evaluate what you're doing in that environment and how you can come up with better solutions and help creatively come up with better solutions.